Hi, I'm Ross. Welcome to my football podcast. Do you feel that the World Cup is finished and now we're immediately into transfer rumours in England, especially, and Scottish clubs once again struggling in Europe? And there's been no real analysis of what happened post World Cup, where Scotland and England stand in European football while looking ahead to Euro 2028. So that's what I want to do on this edition of my podcast. I've done a tier list and I want to talk about why I've put the countries that qualified for the World Cup in certain tiers. And that relates to not just how they did at the World Cup, but how I think they'll do going forward over the next couple of years, heading into the next Euros. And I'm going to pay particular attention to Scotland and England, seeing as I am Scottish and live in the UK. So, S tier, Spain and France. Spain, obvious choice as the World Cup champions, and France, obvious choice as the team that most fancied going into the tournament to win, and they were beaten by Spain. But I think both these teams are capable of beating each other depending on the day. Now, while Spain won the World Cup and they're also the defending European champions, I think they are beatable and beatable by really good teams, which France fall in the category of. Why do I say Spain are beatable? Well, I think their team lacks two major strengths, and that's for all the strengths that they have. They lack an elite, prolific striker, and they lack a huge goal threat from outside the box from their midfielders. Oyarzabal does a great job for the team as their number 9, but a lot of his strengths are to do with his ability to press the opposition and also link the play. As for a final product, he can finish. He takes a great penalty, but he's not Erling Haaland. If Spain had Erling Haaland, they would be by far the favourites for the next couple of competitions. But they don't. And that's one thing I love about international football. So watching the World Cup, it's so refreshing to see every team has its flaws and they're not able to easily go out and solve those flaws just by opening a checkbook, like we see in club football. So Spain have a couple of areas in their team that could be enhanced, but they need the talent to come through to do that. And that's what means that teams like France will always have a chance of beating them. I think there's always the risk of a massive over-appreciation of a team's strengths after they win a tournament. And I'm going to use an example from the NBA here. So the Oklahoma City Thunder were a recent NBA champion. And given the youth in their team and given they had a lot of draft picks left still to use, there was immediately talk of them creating a dynasty and being the team at the top end of the NBA for the next 4 or 5 years. Now, if you don't care about the NBA, just bear with me through this little story because it's going to help me illustrate what I'm talking about. So OKC, their attack was very aggressive, mobile, and fluid. Their defense was focused on shrinking the floor and suffocating the opposition. And they're very good. And they're a contender. They're a contender, but they're not the outright overwhelming favourite to win all the titles going forward. In fact, the most recent NBA season, the championship was won by the New York Knicks, who I did not hear many people predicting that they would win the title at the start of the season, never mind at the start of the playoffs. So I don't think Spain are nailed on to win Euro 2028, although they will be one of the favourites. Just talking about that attack, they only had 5 goals in 3 group games at the World Cup, including a draw with Cape Verde. And then in the 4 knockout games that followed, they had 6 goals. They nearly they were nearly taken to pens in the final by Argentina, and then would have faced a shootout that I think if people had to put money on one side to win that shootout, they'd probably have leaned to Argentina given their record in penalty shootouts recently. So despite their overwhelming domination of the game, their lack of cutting edge almost, I'm not going to say cost them in the end because we don't know how that penalty shootout would have gone, but it nearly meant that they were in a lottery to win the title. France, they made some mistakes against Spain that I'd be looking for them to correct going forward, and perhaps with a change in manager, it will be possible. I think Spain did very well to make Michael Analyse very effective in the game, and then so France really, really struggled to link their midfield with their attack because Analyse was doing most of that work during the tournament, and so you had Mbappe, Dembele, and Barcola to start, who were all pretty ineffective. Tchouaméni and Rabiot in midfield as a 2 was not enough against the Spanish midfield. And we saw France concede a penalty in that game with Digne fouling Lamine Yamal. I think the consensus was going into the tournament that if France had any weaker areas, it would be the fullback position, particularly on the left. And so it proved. So every team has its weaknesses. So despite me having Spain and France in my S tier at the top of the tier chart, I don't think the gap between them and the A tier is massive. And who do I have in the A tier? England. I think England are there or thereabouts. I would not be panicking if I was an English football fan coming out of this World Cup and looking forward to Euro 2028. I think what will really help them is having a bit more bravery and a bit more intention in their play, particularly in defending. So they're kind of intangibles. I think they have the players, but they've got this common flaw that we've seen in tournaments against Croatia in the World Cup, against Italy in the Euros final at Wembley, and now against Argentina, where they've gone ahead in the game, and then there's a sort of supernatural force that takes over the team, and then they just end up wanting to be way too defensive, way too early in the game. And I think manager Thomas Tuchel needs to find a solution to that. I've said in a previous podcast that it'd be unfair to put all the blame on him for that loss to Argentina. And I did a whole podcast on it. So if you want to hear my reasoning, please check out the pod. But really, I think the problem started with the players' mentality and their dropping back before Tuchel tried to make changes in the game. And then he realized any change he would make would not have the positive force he wanted going forward. He was needing to put on defenders to deal with the fact that the team just had this overwhelming defensive mentality. So that's what England need to solve. But if you look at like their recent run, I think they're on track to have a great Euro 2028, which is taking place in the UK. This whole era started at the World Cup in 2018. So it'll be 10 years from that World Cup to the Euros in 2028. They finished fourth, and I think if you look at the England squad, I'd call that an overperformance relative to the players they had available. Then in 2020, they were runners-up in the Euros, losing a penalty shootout to Italy. Familiar story. They were ahead in the game, and then they were pegged back. There was a common theme under Southgate's management of in-game management not being as strong, and certainly not as strong as, I believe it was Roberto Mancini. He was the Italy boss in that game. And then that penalty shootout loss, that is, looking back, such a big loss for England, because I think if they win that, and to use a current popular football phrase, get over the line, and they become champions there, then that monkey is off their backs, to use another cliche. But because it's not, now they're still going to have this problem of dealing with the pressure of not being champions. And that pressure can really affect your mentality during games. So I think not winning that game against Italy, that was, of their current run, definitely their best chance to win a title. It didn't happen, and I think the knock-on effect of that is still being felt. Then they went into the 22 World Cup, got to the quarterfinals, lost to France, probably had the better of that game, and could well have won it. 2024, runners-up again in the Euros, this time losing to Spain. I went into that game thinking, yeah, Spain are the better team, but England could easily, not easily, but could well come through. Did well to get it back to 1-1 and then conceded a late goal to lose. But that was like an admirable effort. And then you've got this 2026 World Cup where really the last 10-15 minutes against Argentina was just a bit of a disaster, and is going to be needed to be, how do you say, bounced back from very quickly, very well over this next run going into Euro 2028. But I think they're right there. I think if they can have a bit more bravery on the ball, a bit more intention in their defending, and find a number 8, and my solution to the number 8 position is Eberechi Eze, and I put that out on a podcast, so please listen to that if you've not. But I do want to do a bit of a deeper dive into that, look at his stats, because I think there have been comments, as soon as I suggested that, suggesting that that's not a good approach, putting him in there. And I want to dive into the statistics to see if some of the suggestions people are making are true or not. So how well does he keep the ball? How well does he progress the ball forward, etc.? People have said it's too risky playing him in there. I'm not sure if it is. I want to see the stats on it. My eyes tell me, from what I've seen of him playing in that position, and that was really the France game in the World Cup, because while he did play in other games in the World Cup, he often came on as a sub and often didn't play in that number 8 role. I know the context of the France game needs to be taken into account, because it went from feeling like a testimonial to a preseason friendly to both teams then thinking they were going to try and win. It was all a bit strange, that bronze match, that third, fourth place playoff. But I thought my eyes definitely showed me that he can play the passes and he can progress the ball the way England need. What's important when you look at sport is to use your eyes and then to look at the stats, or look at the stats and then use your eyes. Because if your eyes are telling you one thing and the stats are telling you something completely different, then you have to start looking at the way you're watching and interpreting the play. If you look at the stats and then your eyes tell you something completely different, then perhaps the stats you're looking at are not as important as you perceive them to be. Maybe you're looking at the wrong stats. So I think you need to look at them both. That's just a suggestion going forward. Anyway, Eze goes in at number 8 for me. England developed the intangibles. They're going to be right there with Spain and France. Right, quick look at the other tiers. I said the pod is going to focus on England and Scotland. Chat a bit about England there. Scotland to come. B tier, me For me, Norway is in the lead here, powered by Erling Haaland. He is the real difference maker for them. But watching them against Brazil in particular, they have some really good midfielders. They keep the ball really well. I think they're a good team. And they have the added addition of probably the best out-and-out traditional number 9 in the world. And then outside of them, we have a list of countries that are going through a rebuild. Netherlands, Portugal, Germany, Belgium. And then we have Switzerland, they're very solid, good all round. And then Sweden, who I think are a mix of sort of superstars in terms of Alexander Isak. And I wouldn't put Gyökeres in the superstar quality, but he has match-winning potential. And then they have players who are not on that level. So I think their floor and ceiling are much further apart than Switzerland, whose floor and ceiling is very close together. And then Norway's floor is quite high, and then their ceiling is really, really high with Erling Haaland. The remaining teams in the World Cup qualified from Europe. Turkey, you could say they're a B tier based on their talent, but often they are people's dark horses heading into tournaments and then they flatter to deceive. Austria, Bosnia, Czech Republic, I don't think any of them massively impressed at the World Cup, and I think they're all beatable. And then we get to Scotland. So for me, Scotland should not fear anyone in that C tier category should they get them in qualifying or at a major tournament. B tier, I have Norway as the best team. Scotland's already beaten them. Now, it's very difficult to do, but Scotland have shown they can do it. Netherlands, Portugal, Germany, Belgium, all going through rebuilds. Switzerland are very interesting, and Scotland have them in the Nations League games. So we have Slovenia away on the 26th of September, Switzerland at home on the 29th of September, and then North Macedonia away on the 3rd of October. That Switzerland game to me is really, really interesting. I think they're underappreciated and undervalued on the international stage, and I want to see how Scotland perform against them, because they're a team who will qualify for major tournaments, make it out of groups, and get into knockout rounds, and they're kind of doing what I hope Scotland will be able to do through the next few tournaments, and I think Scotland definitely have the potential to do it. So that Switzerland game, very interesting. Just a quick run through the England fixtures, because I've got them. They play Spain at home on the 26th of September. That's really interesting to see how both teams come out of the World Cup in that first game that they're going to face. And then Czechia away and Croatia away. Again, good chances for England to show what they can do away against decent to good opposition. So let's see how they get on. Going back to Scotland, they're going to go in to that Switzerland game, that Slovenia game. We still don't know who their manager is. I think there has to be analysis of who Scotland need as a manager. And the name I'm going to suggest for the job is Darren Fletcher. And a lot of people will no doubt immediately say, well, what about his lack of experience for the role? Don't we need someone who's more schooled in tournament football, etc.? Now, when Steve Clarke was still in post after Scotland's elimination from the World Cup was confirmed, which wasn't very long before he resigned. But at that point, I put a post on my Facebook, which is kind of like the start of me wanting to do these podcasts. I put up a post on my Facebook saying, I think Steve Clarke should stay. He shouldn't be sacked. I know he had a huge contract, a long-term contract that he'd signed before the tournament. But I was like, Steve Clarke will hopefully remain in post, because unless you can find a manager who does what he hasn't been able to do, which is get Scotland out of a group. He qualified for 3 major tournaments and we didn't get out of a group. So why would you sack a manager? And I know like they weren't really in the position to do that given his contract, but a lot of people were still suggesting it could happen or hoping he would resign. I was thinking, well, he's got a track record of getting us to major tournaments. Why would we want that to stop and take the risk of getting someone else in? Unless that person has a track record for qualifying for major tournaments and they have a track record of getting out of groups. But now Steve Clarke's gone, so you're looking at the market and seeing who's there. I don't think there's any obvious candidate for a start. So some of the candidates will be suggested are more specialised in international football management. But for all their pluses, nobody seems to have no negatives. So let's just take Roberto Martinez, for example. Let's just say Scotland could afford him and he was interested in the job. I think he's won games as Belgium and Portugal managers, but there's also the criticism that he did not do as well with them as he could have relative to the players he had at his disposal. So I think, given that there's no overwhelming candidate to take the job, and I also think there was immediate shouts for Ange Postecoglou to get the job, and I think he would have been a terrible fit for Scotland because he is pretty ideological in the way he wants to play football, Ange ball, and I think Scotland's biggest issue right now is our central defence, and we need a manager who can, or a management team who can help, ideally, Jack Henry and Scott McKenna become a solid defensive partnership. And then I think there's huge potential in the rest of our team through midfield up into the attack. We've got a load of good young players playing for good teams in good leagues. But that central defensive area is a bit of a concern for me. And I think we have to have a manager who could have a bit more of a pragmatic approach to defence than Ange Postecoglou. But it's not going to be Ange. He's got another job. So, why Darren Fletcher? Well, I think you've seen in international football that having a manager and a team that really identifies with the culture of the nation is huge. So that's another intangible, as it were. What even is that? But I think the most successful national teams do play in the style of the nation. So Scotland, we have a cut and thrust style where we're going to be looking to progress the ball, get it out wide, play with a bit of thunder. And I think Darren Fletcher, having grown up in the Man United way under Sir Alex Ferguson, understands that front foot cut and thrust style that I think would be best utilised to get success with the Scottish national team. I think like this idea that we should create a style of play influenced by Spain, it's just not who we are, and I don't think it's going to work. But you get into the comments and let me know if you think that's not right. But I think someone who really understands the Scottish psyche and can get the best out of these players is going to be very important. And I think he can identify with the players and he can be a leader to these players. He's a strong figurehead, former captain of Scotland, brought up under Sir Alex Ferguson. You should get the culture of the team. You should get the culture of the nation. He's got 80 caps. I think going back to that United way, the classic United way, getting the ball forward, playing with width, I think that's going to be huge for Scotland in terms of the team being able to create more chances. Ben Gannon Doak and Finlay Curtis are going to be very important for us. And I think at international football, being able to make the complex simple, because you don't get lots of time with the players, is important. And that was really Fletcher's style as a player. So I would assume because he has that style, that seems to be something he understands, and it's maybe kind of who he is, the ability to make complex simple. That's another sign for me that he would be a good choice. He's also a good communicator. I say that just based on interviews that I have seen him do on TV, and in my former days as journalist, being around him and heard, and maybe even asked a question that he answered. So it's different being a good communicator with the media to being a good communicator with the players. I think we have to consider that when you hear media analysis of who should get jobs, who should be bigged up, etc., and who shouldn't, their ability to communicate with the media, how they speak to the media, is a consideration that the media makes while they're dealing with that. But that's maybe another topic for another day. But yeah, I think those are the qualities. The potential risk is that we don't really know too much about the tactics and the in-game management that he would use at the elite level. I think he's briefly been a caretaker in charge of the Man United first team for a limited number of games. But in that, he can appoint assistants who can really help with that. But I think those assistants will be assistants for a reason, and they won't be number ones. And he can be that leadership that we need. And then if he needs help in-game, tactics, etc., let's develop that. Call in some experienced heads and get some help there. That's a lot easier to do, calling the experienced heads as number two, than it is to do it the other way around. And you've got a sort of international manager who doesn't get the culture of the country, doesn't communicate well with the players, doesn't have the Scottish psyche, etc. But you have a couple of great assistants who are able to lift the players, etc. You know, that number one's a tactical expert but lacks other skills. Those other skills you're trying to make up for with the assistant. I think it's easier to do the other way around. Do you agree or disagree? Let me know. Also, going to be huge for Scotland. Finding a striker. I've talked about how I think creating chances from wide is going to be very beneficial going forward. We have two good young wingers. If you look at where goals were scored from in the World Cup, a lot of goals scored from in and around the 6-yard box. Goals scored or created from shots from outside the box. Not loads of mid-range goals. Let's talk about like 10, 12, 14 yards out. Having a striker that can finish near the goal, huge. To me, that looks like Robbie Eure. I've seen footage of him playing in Sweden online, and he looks like the type of guy who we could really benefit from in the penalty box. 14 goals in 13 games for league leaders. Serious. His last 4 games, 2 goals, 4 goals, 1 goal, 2 goals, in a great run of form. You could say, well, the Swedish league isn't the strongest league in Europe. I checked the coefficient. Scotland are 18, Sweden are 19. So it's not like the Swedish league in general is dramatically worse quality than the Scottish league. If we had a Scottish striker playing in the Scottish Premier League and he'd scored 14 goals in 13 games, we'd be saying get him in the team. I think that would be the consensus. So Robbie Eure is the hope for me at number 9, and I think he has to start at least 2 of these Nations League games coming up. I'm also hopeful for Kieran Bowie being a big impactful forward for us. But I think if we got Fletcher as manager, that would fill me with cheer. If he announced that Robbie Eure was going to be number 9 for these games, that would fill me with cheer. And going forward, just going back to the tier list, I think Scotland look at B tier and think there's a lot of teams there undergoing rebuilds. So that's nothing to fear. Norway, they look the strongest of the teams in that category. We've beaten them before. England, Spain, France. We have drawn with England in a competitive fixture at a major tournament. We've beaten Spain before. There's not many countries out there just now that can say that. I think the toughest game out of those teams for us would be France because of my concern over Scotland's centre half and the strength in the French attack. So I'd really like that if we get to Euro 2028, we don't get France. But I think the other teams, if it was the group stage or a qualifier against Spain or England, I would not be massively fearful. I would not be massively optimistic, but I would think Scotland have a good chance, or a chance. And then anyone else that I've mentioned, I think, again, Scotland have a chance. And that's a good place to be in heading into Euro 2028, coming off World Cup 2026. So that's my thoughts on where international football stands just now. I wanted to put out a pod on it. I didn't want to just put out some pods on the World Cup and then close that book and then we just go flying into the club season and forget about international football for another 2 years. So they're my thoughts. Get into the comments. Let me know what you think. And I'll be back soon when I've got something that's happened in football that I think's worth chatting about.